All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good evening. Inshallah, we'll be starting. I'm going to ask the audience to please mute yourself and also turn off your video except for the speaker, Brother Adam. And we can come back on video during the Q&A. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today, we have the pleasure to have with us Dr. Adam Browning, who is going to animate a session with us on an important topic in leadership, educational leadership. Before getting into the subject of the day, I just wanted to put this presentation in context. Horizon Academy Institute is a society that's been operating in Alberta since 2008. We operate a weekend school, a full-time school K to grade 9, a daycare and a preschool, and we have a leadership institute. Today's talk is under the umbrella of Leadership Institute, and about 3 years ago, Horizon have decided to do a strategic review of its framework to bring focus to a specific work, and we've adopted to that the design thinking process. And for those who are not familiar with the design thinking process, it's a 6-step process where you use when you are trying to tackle complex questions that don't have a straightforward algorithm. And when it comes to education, it is always a difficult question to answer. And so you start by empathizing, using research and developing understanding of different dimensions of the question at hand. You attempt to define the question at time, because many times when we start with a mild defined question, we may find the answer, but it's the best answer for the wrong question. You engage in ideation, where you explore different scenarios, and then you start coming up with prototypes to answer the question. And then after that, you test those prototypes and you implement. One of the projects that Horizon have taken is to revisit its vision. And we had a vision that actually did not, that we came up with in 2011 that didn't really reflect the work that we're doing. And so in a year-long work, we've come up with this new vision that I have on the screen: developing leaders through transformational learning. And this was a lot of work to get to this sentence, but I'm showing you here that the meaning of this vision in terms of the why. And in there, we are bringing in mind a personalized meaning, education as a core point, autonomy, liberation, acceptance of difference. We live in a society that is multicultural, multi-faith. It is important to recognize that we have other people living with us and we're not alone. We attempt to live in harmony, attempt in taking responsibility, reconciliation. Transformation is a keyword that finds its way into this new vision. And we are a society that works in education and in leadership. And so the new vision reads like that: developing leaders through transformational learning. So the meaning of the vision that we came up with is the vision that is building meaning that gets personalized through autonomy, enabling a liberation built on confidence and pluralism, that is accepting the differences, targeting harmony that takes form of continuing reconciliation between paths, options, and goals, living life of transformation of oneself and the environment by experimenting ethical actions. And finally, this is a vision that communicates clearly and powerfully our cause in what we are doing in education and leadership in terms of meaning, liberation, harmony, and transformation. So this is the new vision of Horizon. This is the mission of Horizon. I'll give you a moment to read it while I'm allowing some people to get in that are looking for the password for the meeting. All right. Now, over the years, the last decade, the Leadership Institute have engaged in programs in this 4 quadrants. One is what we call al-bina al-fikri, the intellectual foundation of the community member. Second is al-bina al-akhlaqi, that is applied ethics. Third is al-bina al-maharati, or applied leadership, or skills. Fourth is al-bina al-ruhi, or tazkiyah, or spirituality. And today's talk is under education leadership. Dr. Adam Browning today joined us to talk to us about an important subject. When we look at Calgary, we will live here in Alberta, since 2015, Calgary have seen a tremendous growth when it comes to population growth. In 2015, so an average of 13,750 people per year were coming new to Calgary. The city of Calgary is forecasting that the population of Calgary will reach 1,381,000 people in 2024. This is an increase of 95,000 persons over the next 5 years. This average early increase of approximately 19,000 per year will be driven primarily by net migration to the city. And you could extrapolate the same thing for other cities, major cities in Alberta, in Edmonton, or any major city in Canada. So this new immigration has resulted in school district throughout Alberta experiencing a significant increase in the number of English language learners, what's customarily called ELLs. The students are either young arrival to Canada, or they are the Canadian-born children of immigrants speaking a non-English primary language at home. In our school now, Horizon Leadership Academy, we have people speaking over 30 languages. We have people speaking Arabic, people speaking Mandarin, people speaking Somali language, all kind of language, Urdu, so that all compounded with our children. Young ELLs have the dual challenge of learning oral language and literacy simultaneously upon their arrival at school. And many of these youngsters start school with a few hundred words acquired from watching television and interacting with native English-speaking neighbors. Studies have shown that it may take many years for students to catch up with language proficiency in this context. And so today we're hoping that Dr. Adam Browning will tackle some of these questions that I'm showing here on the screen. What pattern of early literacy and language are predictive academic literacy learning in language art provincial achievement tests, or PATs? How do the quality of printing and spelling accuracy and productive vocabulary knowledge contribute most to students' writing scores at grades 2nd, 4th, and 6th? How do mainstream teachers mediate language instruction for ELLs? I'm very happy that we have today with us Dr. Adam Browning. Dr. Adam Browning is known by many of you. He's a Muslim educator. He was a school administrator for 10 years prior to moving into system level leadership. As a director of education with Palliser School Division, Dr. Browning recently completed his doctoral studies at the University of Calgary in the Faculty of Language and Literacy. Adam's research is in applied linguistics is focused primarily on literacy and language acquisition for English language learner. His research is focused on how students' early literacy skills set the foundation for later academic literacy. Without further ado, I'll please, Adam, go ahead and share with us some of the knowledge.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Nuruddin, and Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I recently finished my defense a few weeks ago, and I'm still getting used to the term doctor. I've not shared my success with my colleagues, but Dr. Nuruddin was one of the first people I shared with after my family. He's been a friend and a mentor and a colleague. And so hearing that come from Dr. Nuruddin I'm grateful, but there's also that level of humility, knowing that he's a mentor of mine. I'm usually comfortable presenting in crowds, but it's difficult for me with Dr. Nuruddin there. So I hope that you'll have patience with me. I'm also relatively new to the Zoom platform. I do best with questions, so please raise them throughout. I'm going to share my screen. It may not allow me to see all of your questions, so if I miss it and you've typed something, please just feel free to share that, and I'd be happy to answer throughout.
I will keep up with the questions, inshallah.
Thank you. I'm going to share so I'm really going to start this here. This is a picture from the better part of 10 years ago when I was much younger than I am now. I'm still fairly young, but like Dr. Nuruddin had mentioned, my experience as an educator primarily has been in the Islamic school system, and I'm really grateful for that. It gave me a wealth of knowledge Islamically, but also linguistically. It's not untypical in our schools. In Calgary, when I joined our Islamic school system in 2009, we had 547 students. I remember our student population at that time. And as of today, alhamdulillah, we have the better part of over 1,800 students in Islamic schools who are learning simultaneously English and academic English and Arabic. And so I put this picture up because a great part of my career has been spent with Muslim students and families who are interested in language acquisition. And it's given me the chance as an educator, but as an academic, to research a problem of practice. So my broader purpose, and I know that Dr. Nuruddin had put up some slides with my research questions. I've tried to take them and I've tried to make them a little bit more applicable to what they are, so that they're not just in academic jargon, but they can more broadly relate, because I realize that we have some people who are joining us internationally, and I'm grateful to meet you all and to have you here for this. So the big areas that frame my research have been looking at the broader patterns of language learning. And so I've done a longitudinal study of students from the time that they joined the school system in kindergarten until they were in grade 12. And from there, I've tried to look at a cohort of students and do a cohort analysis to take a look at these early language and literacy skills. So their early reading skills, their early language skills, their productive vocabulary, and how they've done throughout our Provincial Achievement Tests at grades 3, 6, and 9. I've also been able to take these students and look at their writing samples throughout elementary to see how they might lend to their overall success. In Alberta, in our context, we have something called an assurance model, and our government looks at the progress of students in English language arts and math, science, social studies at a provincial level, but we found gaps. And sometimes I found that with the analysis at the school level or at the community level, it might be looking at, well, how did this grade 9 group of grade 9s do this year compared to a group of grade 9 students next year? And we don't really get to see that longitudinal pattern. So that was the central premise of my study and what I was most interested in. A second part to it, so for the academics, I did a sequential mixed methodological study. The primary point of my study was a database study, but I also included qualitative perspectives and surveyed a number of my colleagues and people who teach second language in all types of subjects to see what their input was into the subject area. So to frame my study, the conceptual underpinnings, some of the big pieces that we knew, we've known for years looking at our provincial data. We have 40% of the kids in my school system of 9,000 students approximately are English language learners. My experience and empirical research will say that, you know, our English language learners, they pick up fairly easily early reading skills, and we measure that throughout school. And I'm worried that sometimes it gets missed that students have this basic literacy skill, but it doesn't necessarily translate into this big thing that we want to look at, which is this later academic literacy. And I'll expand on that. We see that kids very quickly, they pick up phonemic awareness, they understand letters and the sounds they make, and they learn phonics. You know, you can learn how to read or the basic code of reading in English with around 100 hours of solid instruction. And I've seen lots of our English language learners pick those skills up. And I've seen it in this group of 141 students that my study was focused on, faster than native speakers of English, kids who are only speaking English. They learn fairly easily this communicative skill, and it's quickly acquired. Sometimes you have students who moved here and they have an impetus to learn it. I call it the language of the playground. They can learn that within 6 months. The impetus is to be able to communicate with their friends. What we don't see as easily, and has been the focus of my research, is what I've noticed, and this is this problem of practice. And I'll share a little bit of a vignette, a story about how I framed my research, what brought me to it. I was having a conversation with a group of high school science teachers, and a biology teacher was looking at and very frustrated with the levels that her students were performing at in their diploma exams in grade 12. And she was seeing these gaps. And working backwards and looking at some of these students and these conversations, we've really seen that some of this is inherited, and that there were these earlier areas. If you took one grade 12 student and you pulled out their exams and their writing samples and the conversations with their teachers and tried to look at it, you could see these windows where really thorough intervention would have helped. And sometimes when we miss those gaps, the gaps become cumulative. The big thing that I see in my research, as well as my practice, and I do somewhat interchange on this. I know that my audience, I might have a linguist in here who's going to challenge me on that. So I hope I'm not interchanging too much. My experience and my research really emphasize vocabulary and the importance of vocabulary with early language and literacy. A little bit of the research basis that I've looked at that's helped me frame this. There's a man named Jim Cummins, Dr. Jim Cummins, and he's come up with this framework called BICS and CALP, Basic Interpersonal Communicative Skills and Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. He uses, and some academics and linguists have used, this iceberg theory to be able to describe this paradigm for looking at language. When you look at BICS and CALP, what you see is that students who generally come to school, whether they are students who are born in Canada, but their parents maybe speak a second language at home, or they've moved here, they pick up this basic interpersonal communicative skill fairly easily. And that's those early reading skills, phonics, phonemic awareness, basic discourse. But what we don't see, and that's fairly easy for teachers to measure, what we don't see, and it's much more difficult, is this cognitive academic language proficiency. We see with BICS that it probably takes 1 to 2 years for a student to develop that, sometimes quicker. With cognitive academic language proficiency, we look at, basically 7 to 10 years. And I'm going to pose this question to you, and I'm going to invite people to give verbal responses. Where do you think the first area, or let's say the first grade and the first subject where we really start to see language deficits in the school system? That's an open question.
So somebody say science, somebody say English.
Yeah, and then we have these common conversations with educators about where, and I really am interested for whoever had answered science. Is that a teacher who's answered science?
She's an admin.
She's an admin. Yeah, science is one of the first areas where we really start to see a language deficit in grade 5 science. Linguists will not agree on a lot of things, but they'll agree that the early foundations for language are vocabulary and that heavy emphasis on oral productive language. And the other areas is the gaps where we really start to see them form, where they're more noticeable, but they have a root to it. And they see it in grade 5 science because if you think about the language, the early language learning of students, oftentimes we teach them from storybooks and basic conversation. And so they get narrative language fairly easily. Things that are written in the first person, shorter sentences, easier vocabulary. When you look at a grade 5 science book, you look at longer sentences that are written in an expository language. You're not written in the first person. It has that objective third person language of science, technical vocabulary, complex grammatical forms in there, and really that vocabulary piece becomes more technical and protracted for students, and that's where you start to see some of these gaps form. Some of the research that I looked at to compare my research to and to help guide it, one of them is quite famous. It's a study called the 30 million word gap by Chall and Jacobs in the 90s. They went into dozens of homes and they profiled the language of students, or young children from the ages of birth until 3. So basically what they did is they witnessed speech inside the home and they did it for a certain amount of time so they could project how many words a student was being exposed to. And what they found with these dozens of families that they were looking at is they came up with the title of the 30 million word gap. And they looked at gaps between students who are maybe coming from lower income or socioeconomic status families, and then gaps for students who are coming from some language minority families. They were learning English as another language. And they looked at the education levels of parents. What they found with this is that from 0 to 3, students were predominantly from families with educated families. They were being exposed to around 50 million words. And kids on the reverse were being exposed to around 20 million words. When they came back and revisited where these students were in kindergarten, they found that students had around half of the vocabulary. That group from the 20 million words had a smaller vocabulary, roughly of 2,000 words, and the other group had double that, who had been exposed to more vocabulary. When they went to look in grade 3, they could see this compounding effect where those kids were doing far better in their academics than the other kids. And it's something that I tell teachers, it can be remediated, but the earlier it can be recognized, the better. And so I'm starting to think that, and I'll touch on this more in the implications, one of the areas we need to start working with is beyond the school system. It's with families, and it comes to the basis of our religion of read and talk about it and exposure to language. And I'm seeing that more and more. Researchers, when they looked at this, another researcher named Stanovich, he looked at a bunch of like a meta-analysis to look at language learning and literacy learning of students. And one of the primary findings that he came up with was something he used to describe as the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect has been used in other sciences to describe cumulative advantage or cumulative disadvantage. But what he described is that when you start seeing these gaps in reading, these gaps in language, it often originates from gaps in early literacy and gaps in early language. And over time, those gaps compound. I don't have it as a slide here, but if we were to look at the vocabulary levels that are necessary to get through the curriculum in Alberta for a student who's on their way to university, they need around 80,000 words, which is 15 to 18,000 word families by the time they're in grade 12 to be successful on that track towards university for the most part. What you look at is that gap, that graph, it's not linear. It is actually very exponential. And you can see major junctures between grade 3 and 4, grade 7 and 8, and grade 9 and 12, where you have these big jumps in the amount of vocabulary a student needs to get through the curriculum. By all means, in Alberta, a student can get through the grade 3 curriculum with about 3,000 word families, but they need around 12,000 words to be able to get through the grade 4 curriculum. So sorry, I meant to say that 5,000 words in grade 3 and 12,000 in grade 4. And so these gaps are quite exponential. And you can see that when kids don't have that language and knowledge, cognitive, executive functioning, they work cumulatively. They have a cumulative effect. And that's a complicated subject. I won't delve too much into it because I take a linguistics approach to it. And I know that there's probably some medical doctors here who would take a different perspectives on it as well. But I see it working cumulatively. And if they are not at these certain thresholds, by the time they move on to more advanced curriculums, those gaps compound. So moving through this, and I'm learning that after writing 200 and something pages in my dissertation, to shorten it down is quite difficult. I looked at the longitudinal analysis of 141 students. These students we'd had in schools in Alberta, in more than one school. They'd actually been in 4 schools. They had taken early language and literacy samples for these students. We looked at their language samples. We used a book called Boy, Dog, Frog in 2009 for this group of students, and we had them with this wordless picture book tell a story. And we recorded that story and all that they had said about it as they walked through it to analyze the vocabulary. We also had them do some early reading screeners as well. And we did a test called the Expressive One-Word Picture Vocabulary Test. And that's where you show students a set of pictures to see what their knowledge of a picture is. They may have a picture of a coyote or a fox, and you have many students who may only recognize that as a dog because they don't have the depth of that vocabulary. We took that for these 141 students, and that's something I inherited as part of my research, was to be able to work from that sample to follow up with these kids at various junctures, because that really set the foundation for my research to look at what patterns of that early literacy and early language with this group would be predictive of their success as they went on to later grades and harder academics. I used a program, it's openly accessible on the internet, it's lextutor.ca, but it's a vocabulary or language sampling analysis software. And it let me take more of a statistical look at the types of words that kids were using to be able to see what vocabulary did they have coming into school and the types of different words and the amount of vocabulary to be able to describe something. I also took these writing samples, as Dr. Noureddin had said, and I actually took them at several different levels, but I only had enough to be able to contribute statistically in a valid way at grades 2, 4, and 6. And really, the questions I was interested in there was, what overall would really lend to a student having really strong writing skills? Oftentimes in research around linguistics or action-based research in schools, it has a real focus on reading and early reading skills, and writing something that I have found that has been neglected. And it's a really good indicator of what a student's overall vocabulary is and their access to language. If you think about it, your expressive abilities, your receptive abilities, your abilities to listen and to read, the application of those abilities are the expressive ones. So when you go to speaking and writing, it becomes much more difficult. You can see strengths and you can see gaps often more clearly. So I had analyzed a number of factors in that. I had looked at some early, I call them fluency skills, but I did look at spelling. I also looked at legibility. I looked at how students were using vocabulary in there, and I looked at how they're addressing a number of other pieces to see how did it contribute to their overall success with writing. My findings. So I had findings at various junctures, and then I'll turn it over to questions after this. The biggest findings that I found at grade 3 were that there were very few significant differences between English language learners and native speakers of English on early reading skills. On the early reading measures we used, I had actually found in some groups that our English language learners picked up basic phonics oftentimes more quickly than native speakers. What didn't show as easily, and I had to see it over time, was that the vocabulary was quite different. So even though the students had similar reading skills, I could see vocabulary deficits when I was looking at their grade 3 provincial achievement tests in language arts. When you look at that and those two lines on that graph I have, that is, the top line would be our English language learners, and the bottom line, the green line, would be native speakers of English. That was a look very much at the level of basic, the first 500 words. So using LexTutor language sampling analysis, it breaks down words into word bands, or language into word bands of approximately 1,000 words per band. The first band is only 500, but then the second band goes to 1,500 and the third band to 2,500. And it helps you look at the amount of English a student has at their availability. Most students, like in basic conversational English, including in this presentation, we all typically as adults probably use 75% of our vocabulary is these basic everyday words, that BICS language, band 1, he, she, this, that, then, to, very simple words, simpler vocabulary. What we found here is that the majority of the words that students had at their availability in grade 3, they were really relying on these band 1 words, whereas the native speakers of English were starting to look at band 2, 3 words and beyond. That's where you started to see the difference over time. When I compared longitudinally, and I often ask educators this, if I was to say, if you're looking at, so here, if you have grade 3 provincial achievement tests, and you have grade 6 provincial achievement tests, and then grade 9 provincial achievement tests. I am not a statistician by background, but I had to have a tutor who is a doctor of statistics work with me. And when we were working through this, his natural inclination was to say, well, grade 3 should be the best predictor of grade 6, and grade 6 should be the best predictor of grade 9. I had told him at the time that, language theory, when you look at it, is oftentimes, and we call this the grade 4 slump. You can see with Cummins' theory of BICS and CALP, he'll describe it as the iceberg theory, but he'll also describe it as learning to read and reading to learn. So as kids learn to read, we can measure that, but as they read to learn from grades 4 onwards, it's not as easy to measure. And so the measurements that we have in grade 6 on our provincial achievement test, they're primarily around reading, and they're not necessarily the best indicator of how a student's going to do in grade 9 or how they're going to do in grade 12 or at university. And it can be somewhat misleading for educators and families in the school system, where they don't see this big drop coming because of the language demands that increase. So what I had found in the overall findings was that the biggest predictors for grade 9 working backwards was a combination between grade 3 PATs and early vocabulary. And they were not each, I did a linear regression, and they were mutually contributing to the success of students in grade 9. Grade 6s did not factor in, and that was a big finding for me. It's been proven internationally, or it's been proven in other empirical studies, but it hasn't been proven longitudinally in Canada. And so that was a foundational finding of my study, that to show with this group of students that their early vocabulary skills, their early receptive vocabulary, their early productive vocabulary, the types of words they knew, the different types, were a foundational piece for how they would do in later academic literacy in grade 9. I also found close relationships between how students would do in math with how students would do in language arts. And what I did is I took this research and I asked the schools who were participating to give me the data for all of their students. So we're talking 700 plus students. And I looked at and compared the gaps that I could see. Generally what I found was that in grade 6, I found a gap of about 8% in language arts between English language learners and native speakers of English. And I also found a gap in math of about 10%. That gap in grade 6, and by the time I got to grade 9, has grown to 10% in language arts and 12% in math. And we're talking hundreds of students. When I go back and I look and I triangulate looking through my data, the students who had that strong expressive vocabulary, lots of early language and literacy opportunities, they are able to grasp these concepts more quickly. I also found some differences between groups. Conventional thinking for some would have it that students who are born in Canada may have a depth of language, or they may not have an accent, so they might fare better with English. What we found, and this is not untypical, I've just replicated this, or I've found a finding similar to other studies. We found that students who'd moved here after the age of 5 fared better than students who were born here. We found that students who'd moved here after the age of 12 fared even better than those students. And the reasons for that, without being able to generate and look individually by student, the research will tell us and the theory will tell us that when students have that real strong language ability, or if they're learning languages simultaneously, they have a depth of language that they can transfer to. So when I look at Dr. Noureddin, for example, not to pick on him, you know, he was a fluent Arabic speaker and a fluent French speaker. Learning English, he already had this strong basis in conceptual knowledge that he was able to transfer over. We see kids, particularly in Canada, who may speak dialect of Arabic at home. They're learning Fusha, or formal dialect of Arabic at school, and maybe they're learning academic English as well. And they may have a broad language base. They may actually know more words than other students. But when you look at the depth of the language they have, they may not understand more advanced concepts or more advanced vocabulary in that one language. And so there's a lot of language myths about language learning. It's really contextual. There's a lot of variabilities, and it depends by student. But that was a finding that we found as well. When you look at, and I compare my research to that of other researchers, what I've been able to do is fill in some of the gaps. We've looked at Scott Douglas, for instance, and Hedy Roosing. These are well-known linguists in Alberta. They've looked at the performance of English language learners by the time they get into university, and they're seeing gaps in subjects, depending on the student and their background, that are often being missed in the school system. I've looked at hundreds of samples of students in grade 9, and teachers will always talk about their reading assessments. They'll use benchmark literacy assessments to assess students. When I've done a kind of comparison between groups, I don't see a difference in the literacy assessments at grade 9 for hundreds of students between English language learners and non-English language learners. Oftentimes where the gap is we're measuring that basic fluency in a student's ability to read, not their comprehension skills. That's much more difficult to assess, and that's where it becomes missed. We see it in their writing, though. I'm going to stop presenting that and then talk about my overall implications. But I'd like to answer some questions first, or have more of a conversation.
So thank you, Adam. We have a question from Omar from Maryland in US. Question says, how does one go about helping students from lower income families build their vocabulary skills at younger ages?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that, Omar. I think that the more that, so it depends on who's asking. I mean, if we're looking at the school level, I would say that the earlier, the better that we can assess this early on and recognize it and have intervention at the school level. That's the biggest piece. Teachers can make a difference if they have explicit, strong vocabulary instruction. So this is the message. I'll give my message on 3 levels. The message I'd have to teachers are this. If you look at those 80,000 words that kids need to have by the time they're entering into the university system, 10,000 of them are words that they're going to learn approximately through explicit instruction. They're going to learn words like, Dr. Noureddin, can you give me a medical word?
Diagnosis.
Diagnosis. They're not going to just understand diagnosis in context. They're likely going to have to be taught that word and how it may relate across context. They're going to have visuals attached to it. The teacher's going to have to use it in different ways. When you look at an English language learner, they probably need about, on average, researchers will say different numbers, but you need around 7 exposures to a word if that's in your primary language that you're strong in, to be able to have it as part of your vocabulary. If you're an English language learner, it can take up to, researchers will say anywhere between 15 to 36 exposures. But I would say it depends on the type of exposure. For teachers, those 10,000 words, they're really the gateway into the rest of the vocabulary. Kids are going to learn the other 20,000 words. So the next 20,000 words through hearing good conversation, especially in the classroom and at home. In the classroom, when you look at the language that a teacher uses, if a teacher, I'll just say this, if they, instead of modulating their language and using both, if they just simplify their language, students won't be able to absorb enough of what they're hearing. I often use the example of the word decimate. It's got a Latin basis to it, desa, but it's got a story behind it that lets people be able to internalize the meanings more when they hear that story, and then it's used in conversation and they see visuals with it. Kids can use those prefixes, those Latin roots, to be able to ascertain meaning, but often it comes in conversation with a teacher with rich visual examples. That next 20,000 comes from good language exposure. The remaining 40,000 approximately comes from being a wide reader or having these broader exposures to language outside of the classroom. So I tell teachers, they'll ask, well, if 10,000 words out of the 80 is that explicit vocabulary, why is it so important? Because with that 10,000, it's like the Matthew effect. If you go into a subject knowing the vocabulary and having a general understanding, you're going to absorb more. But if you're missing those pieces, then you're going to miss that, and then it's going to accumulate over time as you need that one subject matter to learn the next subject matter, and you're at this cumulative disadvantage. And so that's why that 10,000, I'm not sure if I've explained it that well, but that's why it's so important. And that's my message to teachers, vocabulary instruction. My message to families is lots of language opportunities. I don't like to quote facts, obscure facts, because I wonder how empirically researched they are. I've become somewhat critical. I've seen research that has talked about the average amount of time that kids get exposed to conversation in their home in North America is around 5 minutes of structured conversation a day. Over-reliance on technology, it can become very problematic. We look at, when we were going to find samples of language for native speakers, myself and Dr. Hetty Rusing, we went to a wealthier neighborhood in Calgary with many families through a private charter school where we were taking language samples. These students only spoke English. They lived in the wealthiest area of Calgary. We found many of them had language levels similar to what the 30 million word gap study had found. For all intents and purposes, there's something in Alberta called an ESL benchmark, and it's a proficiency scale. These students would have been classified as ESL students, except that they didn't speak any other language other than English. And so what we're seeing now is that earlier study of the 30 million word gap is actually extending to lots of families and lots of kids, because kids are ever more being exposed to less language. So for families, eating at the dinner table, reading to your kids, doing things with them. If a father or mother's in the garage and they're using a wrench and they're a torque wrench, what an opportunity to talk about, torsion. If a student or a child's being exposed to language while a parent is cooking, they're learning the language of science. They're learning direction, sequence, proportion, many things that they're going to be able to carry on. So it's just rich language exposure, opportunities and trips where we're involving our kids in things and reading to them. And that's the implication for families, my broader implications. I think my implications for schools overall, and this would be, Horizon or any school that is doing a great job of being really invested in their students, let's recognize that government measurements often miss important elements of kids' language development. If we look at, and I've heard this conversation over and over at a division level where we're looking at grade 9's 1 year and then grade 9's the next year within a class of under 30 students. And we're trying to ascertain, well, why is this group doing not as well as that group? I see teachers and principals doing brilliant things where they're collecting data over time and they're really delving down deep into writing samples and language samples for kids so that they can intervene as early as possible. And, being cognizant that doing well on our provincial achievement tests, I think they're important. It doesn't necessarily speak to someone's overall character development, but also their development in high school. There is a disconnect between these provincial achievement tests and how a student will do in university, because the bar on some of them are more reading tests. I mean, it can be fairly easy. A student, for example, my study, I was seeing that kids could pass the grade 6 provincial achievement test being in the bottom 5th percentile for vocabulary. So some of our provincial achievement tests need to be supplemented because they're not the best measure, and that's what I would recommend at the system level.
Okay, we have another question. That's a question that actually I wrote there. What is the impact of the gaming revolution and multimedia, positive or negative, on English literacy?
I don't have research on that overall. I've looked at research on that. That hasn't been the focus of my research. What I've reviewed, I think that when it comes to overall language and literacy levels, it depends on how the technology was used. If students or children are over-relying, our parents are over-relying on them to learn through technology, oftentimes language is incidental, or language acquisition is incidental. They may be playing something and being able to, at ever young ages, being able to use a device well, and we're impressed by it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're gaining great language skills. When I look at my overall experience outside of my research, and I think that at some point, the next area of focus I'll be to look at is non-English language learners, and why we're seeing kids from wealthier families have these decreasing literacy and language levels. Part of it I would attribute to the change in structure of families, that kids are spending less time with their mothers, that more families are having both parents work and spending less time talking to their children. But I'd also say an over-reliance on technology and perceiving that it's hurting language if it's not used effectively.
Did you want to continue and we come back for more questions? Or?
Sure. So I'll take these questions that there are here, and then I can
Go ahead.
Perhaps go off of that.
I have a question from Mesa. Have you researched deeper why the vocabulary difference between ELL and NS, and what is the impact of technology on writing skills?
Two really good questions. The first one is easier for me to answer. So part of my research, when I looked at it and really compared it, I looked at two measures for I looked at three measures for early vocabulary. I looked at their receptive vocabulary, their ability to look at pictures and recognize what those pictures are. And I saw a big gap at an elementary level or at a kindergarten level between English language learners and native speakers of English. And that was something that formed early. The other thing I looked at was something about the simple measure, but the total number of words that a student would have. So when they were telling that that story from that wordless picture book, we counted the number of words that they would use. And that was a fairly good measure, particularly for predicting grade 3 and grade 6, but it wasn't the best measure for predicting grade 9. It did contribute to it, but really what the predictor was the number of different types of words they used. So I'm going to give you an example. We saw lots of examples, and I'm sure many of you have seen this in your experience, of a student who is describing something using repetition. So they were like, I'm really, 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 really sad. And I often do this with groups, and I'm going to do this with this group because I think it's fun. But I'm going to ask you to think about how many different words do you know are variations of the word sad or synonyms of the word sad? And what is the saddest you can be? Most times, especially when we're in an in-person audience, I do this with teachers because I get teachers who are fairly keen, and educators and other people who are fairly smart, and doctors who will come up with around 7 or 8 good words for sad. And then the saddest you can be is morose. When we look at these samples of students when they're talking, there was lots of areas where we'd see gaps where they'd use lots of words, but they'd circumlocate. So they would be like, they would do repetition. I'm really, 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 really sad. Or what they would do is they'd circumlocate and they'd say, he had a big, round, sad face, to be able to describe something, because they didn't have the accuracy or the precision of their language. And we'd see that. And so the different types of words that kids had access to was a major predictor between academic success and not, and for English language learners and native speakers. And we'd see this even from native speakers of English, that if they didn't have enough variety in their productive vocabulary, again, you know, linguists, very few things they're going to agree on, but I think that the majority of us would say that if you were to look at the single best predictor of a student's success linguistically, we would say it would be their productive vocabulary at grade 5, or at the age of 5 years old. So the language that they're using, which is often missed by teachers in the school system because they'll look at how well that student pays attention or how well that student reads, that they might be missed. And my mother, when I finished this study and my defense, she went off about it because she knew that some teachers had said that maybe I wasn't paying enough attention in school or I needed held back. And she said, well, now my son's a doctor. And I always knew it was going to be the case. And I said, of course you did, Mom. But really, when you look at it, I think that early on, I had an interest in books. I was very talkative. I was exploring things and I was interested. And I think that early vocabulary acquisition, that productive vocabulary, is the biggest telltale. I found that in my study, and I just proved it in a group over time. And I think that's what was foundational. I'm expecting to publish past my dissertation on that, probably in conjunction with some others. People have looked at this beyond linguists. I think that an area I'm excited about is the merging between linguistics and medicine, and maybe linguistics and neurology. So I've looked at Chall and Jacob's study, Dr. Nordina and group. I just got this book, but it's the 30 million words, and it's based on that study, but it's written from a medical doctor's perspective.
Yeah, there. Thank you.
So this medical doctor has taken a medical look at it. I'm seeing local doctors and neurologists at the University of Lethbridge who are taking a look at language development from that lens. And I see the convergence and the mergings of these sciences being able to really reinforce this. We're seeing more that students who are being exposed to better language early on have better regulation skills. And we're starting to understand more of the links between language and cognition and how they're so closely linked and cumulative with each other.
I think next question is from a parent perspective. How can we balance supporting our children to enhance their cognitive ability and maximize their vocabulary list, yet maintain speaking our native language at home?
That's another great question. Thank you for asking it. One of the myths that I have, and I have a list of myths that I hear from parents and educators, and they've internalized these myths about how a student may or may not learn a language. And one of the myths I've seen is that if a student is having difficulty with a language, should we be teaching them their first language? Or if a student is already learning one language, he or she shouldn't study another language. It really depends on the student, right? There's two dimensions to that myth. I think the first is that people often have this misled belief that studying multiple language can kind of reduce your overall skill. We are seeing that with some kids, but generally that's not the case. I think it depends on their exposure to that first language and where that student's at. So really, to kind of get back to your question, if a student is a fairly proficient speaker in Arabic, and that is their first dominant language, then our experience is showing us that they can make a fairly easier transition to English, especially if they're learning it together. When I was working in the Islamic schools, I would have Islamic studies teachers reinforcing vocabulary. In grade 1, if you have students who are, especially if you can group them together that you know enough similarities and you have them learning sentences together, like in a sentence in English and a sentence in Arabic, they can compare language structures. And this is where, at a school level, there's basically a few different streams. The research behind bilingual programs is different than what we're seeing in our context, because they're learning French and English mostly together at the same time, coterminously, and there's less of an issue. The challenges that we see with language education in our settings is we may not be teaching any one language enough to give students dominance in that language. When you look at the amount of time in some of our private schools or Islamic schools in which kids are being exposed to Fusha versus what they speak at home, it's not enough. I mean, if there's a sweet spot, I would say it's over 160 minutes a week, and we're not doing that. And so it all depends on the child. So kind of back to that piece of what parents can do to help achieve proficiency in both English and Arabic. Don't stop speaking Arabic. I would say encourage you to speak Arabic, but I'd make sure that your kids have lots of opportunity to speak. I see kids over and over in the system whose parents speak Arabic fluently at home, and they actually have fairly strong Arabic skills. Maybe it's not their academic language, but overall they've been exposed to enough language that there's less of an issue as they move on to academics. What I'd also say is, know your child. If you're seeing, so knowing that we have to have 80,000 words to do well in a university context, we've seen lots of speakers who move here after the age of 12 who are able to do fairly well in their fields with 30,000 words because they had such a strong first language that they make that transition to their academic area. And so it really depends where that student is. It's a contentious area, and I expected to be asked this, but I've been asked more often of, should all kids be learning Arabic inside Islamic schools? And I mean, I'm a proponent of that all kids should be learning Arabic. I think that sometimes we need to look a little bit more individually at that one child and say, are they ready for this? Do they have the basics before they're ready to add more on? That's tough to convince parents and educators of, though.
Very good. Another question here from an instructor. How far is the online reading platform contribute to the academic vocabulary acquisition?
I would say minimally, Doctor, on that question. I think it depends on the reading platform. But again, what I looked at, and I almost feel like pulling it up, when I look at a system level, and I've compared this back from hundreds and hundreds of students to look at what these online or leveled literacy platforms look like, especially if it's not instructed, I think it contributes very little to vocabulary acquisition. I think it helps. I think it's important that, it's really in this paradigm of learning to read and reading to learn. The earlier that we can make sure kids get these skills, the better it is for them. And this kind of ties into another question I was asked about the use of technology with writing. When you look at language acquisition, these early skills are important, like legibility and spelling for writing. And for reading, early reading skills are important too. And I've often been misperceived as saying maybe they're not. I think they're important, and I think that they're crucial up to a certain level. If a student doesn't have these abilities by a certain level, you can't compensate for it by giving them extra reading instruction on an online platform, and you can't compensate it by giving them a word processor or technology when they don't have these basic skills. Because if you look at language and cognition interacting, or they're layering and working together cumulatively, at any point or any juncture, if kids fall behind in these areas, then they end up basically having the Matthew effect. When I looked at the writing samples of students, I could see some students who had poor spelling, poor control over their handwriting, and we're seeing from studies now that it's crucially important. Because when you think about it, the more time you spend on thinking how to spell something and how to write something, the longer and the more it takes away from your executive functioning abilities. You're not able to think about the quality of ideas and the quality of words you're using because you're thinking about how to hold the pencil. And the same thing applies for reading. So I think that the earlier we're able to do those things, the better. I think that the online reading platforms work in conjunction with good instruction. There's no supplement for good instruction from a parent reading with their child or a teacher teaching a child how to read in a classroom setting using actual books. I think that there's more benefit to it, and really it's making sure that we do that as early as possible. Our researchers will say that 92% of kids should have reading fluency by grade 3. If they don't have that perfect fluency in their ability to read, they may not understand everything they read, but they understand the code. If they don't have that, then deficits are going to start adding up as they start moving into more academic areas of literacy.
I think next question, you touch based it a little bit. I'm going to read it just in case you have some addition on it from Ismail. How can we as Arabic Muslims balance the challenge of trying to help our kids achieve proficiency in both English and Arabic?
I've touched on that somewhat. I really think that it depends on, I'm going to answer it from the perspective of me giving parents advice on this. I would say that speaking to your students or your kids and their first language at home is crucial. It's crucial for their overall identity, their development, but I think it's also the types of words that we use. So I'll share something here. my background, people often ask me, what are you? It's complicated. I'm a Heinz 57 mix. My mother's father was an orphan from Lebanon. And my mother's grandfather was an orphan from Lebanon. His mother was, Ukrainian, or his wife is Ukrainian, and the other side of her family were a mix of things, Métis and other things from Saskatchewan. And so my mother didn't speak Arabic, and her father didn't, but I've been trying to learn Arabic.
We need your DNA.
Sorry?
We need your DNA.
Yes, right? When I look at that and their ability to, kids to learn English or to learn multiple languages, it's definitely there. But being someone who can get by in basic Arabic, often what I've heard parents say to their kids is, "Jibi this, ruh here, do that," and it's a mix between English and Arabic. And the language that's used is like procedural and directive. So kids will have that language of basic understanding, but then if you ask them for, the meaning of the word ta'awun or ta'awuniya, cooperation, do they have that? And so I think it's the quality of the language exposures that we give our kids. And that's where, when you're in the garage and you have a torsion wrench and then you're linking it back to the word torsion, and it's not just the TV, but there's actually decent conversations around the dinner table, or you're exposing to the language of the Quran, a more advanced language. I had a teacher, Dr. Muhammad Saleh, he really pushed me into the field of education when I was a young man. And one of the things he told me at the time was he would teach me tafsir, and he taught me the word fasuk. And he described it so well that I could never forget the word. And he said, like when I looked at the word in the translation of it, rebellious, I didn't get it. But when he described it as a process of like the date seed leaving the date, or the pistachio leaving the pistachio seed, I had such more of a rich visual understanding of it that I wouldn't forget it. And so I think that if we expose our kids to those good language opportunities where we really explore the roots of words, they end up loving language. And that, the first word in the Quran, read, iqra. If you take your kids to the library and you get them books and they become wide readers, that's one thing I had. I didn't do well in school, but I was a voracious reader, and I'm a voracious reader to this day. And I've always been a reader. And I think that if we can get kids to love reading, they end up filling in a lot of that language they have. And they may have basic proficiency in Arabic, but it doesn't limit them from having real academic proficiency in English. Or better yet, if you have them in an Islamic school and they're having really good exposures to both language, they may be able to pick up both simultaneously at an academic level. And I've seen that from people.
Mona, a health professional, has a question here. If the child is having stutter, how this affects language, vocabulary learning, or ability to learn in general?
I couldn't speak as much to that, Sister Mona. I mean, I'm not an occupational therapist. What I know is that in Alberta, 35% of kids come into our system having some type of language deficit beyond vocabulary, like a stutter or a lisp, and we look at remediating that fairly early. I think when it comes to a student's expressive ability, you learn by talking and you learn by listening and engaging in both. And if someone has something that's prohibiting from that, it would accumulate, or it would limit their overall language learning somewhat. You can see kids who find ways around it, but the earlier those things can be addressed, the better. I know that from the school system.
Rima Madi is asking, does reading aloud classical English literature to our kids help them enrich their academic vocabulary repertoire? Asking from parent perspective for my child.
Yes. When you look at vocabulary learning, I look at 3 tiers of vocabulary. So tier 1 is this everyday talk, that BICS language, basic interpersonal communication language. That's that language that we all speak, that we're using right now. When you look at tier 2 language, it's academic words, but words that are used across different contexts. So the word diagnose can be used past the medical setting. you may look like a word like compare and contrast, and these more procedural words that they're not used in everyday speech, but they're used in lots of academic settings. Then you look at tier 3 words, which are these subject specific words like biome or lowest common denominator, or something very specific to a certain type of science. There's also another type of part of tier 2 words, and they're really good adjectives and adverbs. When you look at English literature, for us to understand the nuances of language, we have to know better words than I'm just really, 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 really sad. And for people to be able to express and understand things. And part of that comes from exposure to more advanced literature. When I was a teacher in school, having just finished my master's, I used to teach a law class and in some language arts options at the Islamic school. And I would love it when I see kids read, but I'd have kids read The Hunger Games, and I would challenge my grade 8s and I'd say, well, that's great that you're reading that. The Hunger Games may have interesting content for you, but it's written at a grade 3 level. Most newspapers are written at a grade 5 level. The National Post might be written at a grade 9 level. When you look at the language that a student would need for their law school entrance exam, and I'll pick on my friend who's a lawyer in here, Nazif, that's a grade 15 language level. So what I would do is I would take the previous law school entrance exams, the reading comprehension questions and logical analysis questions, and I'd give it to my students. And I'd give them more time. And these are high school students. They would get answers. Albeit it might take longer, but more than anything, it just gave them that idea of, so reading overall is good. I'm proud of you if you're doing it. But if you want to read like a mathematician, or you want to read like a lawyer, know the level that you need to read at. And then they know that bar of where they need to get. And so I think exposing kids to, I really like giving them an option, because I think if we just give them something really hard and they can't do it, a student has to be able to understand 95% of what they're reading for it to be contributing. So there's that just right level. But then you need to challenge that and support it as you challenge it for them to experience more complex forms of literacy, and showing them so that they're ready for what that science book looks like. There's a lot of kids who will stay in that comfort zone of storybook language, but then when it comes to reading an expository level article or theory, it's really difficult for them because they weren't scaffolded enough. So to your point, and I answer things long-winded, I think it's important that we give them types of exposures to harder languages.
A question is, what's your advice regarding teaching the kids structured language in the early childhood age in childcare, using phonetic programs, etc.?
I'd probably want to know a little bit more about what's meant by structured language. One of the advantages that I see in the United States is that they're looking at full-day kindergarten. In Alberta, we have half-day kindergarten. I think that the earlier that we can explore, we have a play-based kindergarten. There's some advantages to it. I think that the earlier that we can explore and push kids into rich language opportunities, it very much depends. I've been using a program with our early learning educators across our system called Hannon. A lot of it is based on things that, I'll reinforce, but lots of rich opportunities for kids to play with language and be exposed to language. If you have early learning educators who are well trained, which is sometimes a gap in our systems just because of a lack of funding, but if you have early learning educators who are well trained and they're giving kids really good opportunities around language exposures, you'll see huge advancements. And you can have students who are coming out using phonics. I've never been a big fan of programs. I think there's a commercialization of literacy, and it takes away from teachers' ability. The best literacy program, and I say this across our system, I get asked to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on programs. My answer resoundingly is our teachers are the program, our teachers are the resource. Having a teacher instruct a student on phonics and actually using phonics and sounding things out and exposure to language is a far better teacher than putting a book in front of them. A book should be supplementary and social technology to instruction or time with parents. I'm opinionated on that.
Mohammed is asking, doesn't watching movies, English or Arabic, will help the kid in learning more vocabulary?
I think so. I was speaking to my hairdresser recently, and he's a new arrival to Canada. He's a Syrian brother, and he was asking me why I'm not practicing more with my Ottawa language, and I was telling him I was watching a series on Netflix and some other movie, which was actually just confusing my Arabic, to be honest. I mean, it's already struggling, and I think it depends on the types, but I think generally watching movies and for someone who's new to a language, being exposed to that language, the more exposures they have, the better, and then the quality of exposures they have. For someone to pick up a language, the best way to be able to pick up that language is actually using it in conversation. And this is one of the things that I struggle with in our programs. We often teach kids in Islamic schools how to read the Ottawa language. We don't often teach them how to speak the Ottawa language and to use it in discourse and conversation. And I think that when we do that, there's more of an impetus for them to learn it. You learn language. Language is learned through conversation. It's not learned in isolation. And so I think that...
You remind me, we have an adult Arabic class, and you remind me of one of our previous teachers. She takes the class in a field trip to the Arabic store. Shagana here store, and they get in there and they interact and they see the product and talk to the people there as an attempt to create that kind of conversation for them.
I want to try and exercise to prove something here, if that's okay,
Sure.
with the group. I think you'll find it entertaining. I'm going to give you some random things to memorize, because that's how we were taught to learn things, memorization and rhyme. And I want to see how many of you can repeat it back. So 1, bun, ketchup. 2, shoe, cat. 3, tree, pole. 4, door, bang. 5, hive, bee. 6, sticks, fire. 7, heaven, pray. 8, gate, open. Okay, I've said them. You had some assistance from me because I put in a little bit of rhyme. I was writing them as I was making it up as I was going. So I've had some associations of words, like there's collocations, some words go together. How many can you remember, any of you, that you just worked from just memory in sequence? I'll give you a start. 1.
We have a champion on word association, Omar. He actually teaches this to the leadership class.
Oh, really? MashaAllah. Omar, how many did you memorize in sequence?
I was multitasking, so don't put me in trouble, please.
Okay.
Okay,
we got 1 bun ketchup.
Yeah.
I don't know, like the times I've seen this and I do this sometimes to emphasize something.
Oh, she's
I've
not
seen
done
people,
yet. Dua is shoe cat.
MashaAllah. So to get 5 or 6 random objects is advanced, sister. So that's great. Allah yatik al-afi, that's excellent. So you got 6 sticks, fire, but you've missed some in sequence. Okay. When you do it as a group, it makes it easier to memorize it. I'm going to guarantee you that all of you are going to memorize everything in sequence. All of you, 100% success. But I want you to use your visual memory to do it. So I'm going to repeat these now. And I want you to use your visual imagination. Whether you close your eyes or keep them open, it's up to you. And then we're going to repeat them all together as a group, because just for the sake of time. 1, I want you to imagine pouring ketchup onto a bun. 2, I want you to imagine taking a shoe to shoo away a cat. 3, I want you to imagine a tree right next to a pole. Visualize it. 4, imagine someone banging or bang on the door. 5, imagine bees flying into a hive. 6, imagine using sticks to make a fire. 7, we all pray to get to heaven. 8, imagine opening a gate. So I'm going to do this in unison and everyone can just say it out loud. So 1, bun.
Ketchup.
2,
Cat with the shoe.
3,
tree on a pole.
tree and a bolt. 4,
Bang the
Knocking
door.
on the door.
5,
Banging the door.
banging the door.
The
5,
hive, bees on the hive bees.
Bees with the hive.
6,
Fire with the stick.
Sticks and fire.
so and so on. So you didn't so initially, I think the people who were more advanced got 5 things in sequence. So what we had here is, I guess, 8, times 3. We had 24 things, but it was actually more than that because there was an action associated with each that put those words together. So you actually probably memorized upwards of, 32 separate things using your visual imagination. So the quality of exposure in the way we teach things and that visual. When I teach vocabulary, I'll go back to this word decimate. So the people who have a math background using, we call it your prefixes and suffixes as a way to be able to access language. What does deci mean in Latin? 1/10, right? So someone had 10, thank you. So when you look at that, so here's a vignette I've heard in a classroom. A teacher is talking about Hurricane Sandy on the east coast of the United States, and they've said Hurricane Sandy has decimated buildings and neighborhoods and cities in the east coast of the United States. What do you think decimate means? And that one student who's using, a knowledge of Latin words, and here's an important feature, 50 to 60% of all of our language in English is a Latin base. At an academic level, 60 to 70% of it is all Greek and Latin. So understanding those prefixes and that they can access it. And they said, well, 1/10 of something. And then the teacher says, well, the etymology of the word comes from a general who killed 1/10 of his force for insubordination, a Roman general. When students have a more rich conversation about the root of that word, just like I learned Fasuk, and thanks Dr. Sharif for writing in Arabic, it really, they don't forget that. And it maintains with them better. So the better that they have an explanation or a rich visual exposure to vocabulary, they can maintain it. I've seen Islamic studies teachers use academic vocabulary or words their way as a way to, similar to their English language arts teachers, being able to teach vocabulary. And it's a really good paradigm in a school system. And I've always said this, that the biggest teacher in that school, all of us are responsible for language, not just the language arts teachers. And I love seeing the look on science teachers' faces when they find out that science is that big language deficit area in grade 5, because we're all responsible for teaching it.
Out of curiosity, another question here. How do homeschoolers fare in literacy compared to school kids?
In my experience, what I see at a public school division level, we have a number of demographics or groups who take homeschooling, but maybe not for the right reasons. Like we've had some people who are similar to the Amish groups that they have in the States, low German speaking families or Hutterite families, where maybe they're more of an agrarian or agricultural type of lifestyle. And so their homeschooling experience may be a no schooling experience. And so when I look at, and I do look at levels of all kids in the school system, I take a deep dive into our data. I see gaps usually, but I think it depends on, the student and what they're doing. I know that if a student is spending time with a parent in a homeschooling situation and the mother or father is smart and they're making sure that they learn and they're reading and they're being exposed to things, school almost has limits on what a student can learn within those boundaries if teachers put them there, and oftentimes we do. And in that type of situation, some students can excel. I worry about their socialization abilities and what have you, depending. But so it really just depends on the scenario.
And the homeschooling community tends to do a lot of outdoor activities. They go to the farm. They compensate, but in a different way. I mean, you have less wastage of commute, and so if you have the right structure, definitely. I've seen some very successful homeschoolers. Some parents here with us are homeschooling their kids.
And I would agree. I think it just depends. Like, I know there's a well-known scholar, literacy scholar named Richard Allington. He's very opinionated. He's, if you go to a literacy conference in the States, it's rare that you'll have one where he's not opening in some way. Richard Allington will say that the curriculum, the way we have it set up, there's filler in it. And that in some cases, the processes of schools of line up and the things that we're teaching kids actually take away from really rich language and literacy experiences. And so, yeah, when you're able to cut out some of those and really emphasize on the foundations and rich experiences like good field trips, if they're having those. What pains me is I'll see parents take their kids from a walk and you'll see the parent on the cell phone. And I feel like taking my shoe and doing what we did with the cat, because I'm thinking that, what a great opportunity to talk to your kids about what you're seeing around you. But I'm not a parent. I don't have kids, so I can't fully relate to why they would be doing that. That's my next step, right, Doctor?
Inshallah. So the other thing that I was gonna ask, in the Arabic language, traditionally people memorize a lot of material. They start by memorizing Quran. That's a lot of vocabulary you have there. Classical Arabic vocabulary. I mean, traditionally, kids at 6, 7, they already memorize the whole Quran. And then they get into memorizing poetry of fiqh and poetry of other subjects. Can the same help in the English language? I know back in the days people will memorize Shakespeare or other poetry. Is that something that is still integrated in the modern schooling now, or is that something of the past?
I think it is in our current setting, like in Alberta, probably North America, it's probably more something of the past. And I worry in some ways that, and I think it depends. I know that there's a colleague in here who I've had in the past who we've set up Tahfiz Quran programs together. And one of the areas that we really focused on was looking at making sure the student was the right fit for the program. There's some students who are going to memorize things, and students have a vast ability to memorize, but they're going to make it conceptualizations of it, not just memorization for the sake of rote memorization. When we talk about people learning like the poetry of pre-Islamic Arabia, which was a qualifier for them, in their scholarship, they conceptualized it. They didn't memorize it just baselessly with being able to repeat it. They had an understanding of it and a rich understanding of it. And so I think it's the quality that we're trying to expose kids to. I think in that, it's been a good notion for the school systems to focus on that. I think where we've lost it is, there is something about memorizing. Like if you look at in history, what people have been able to memorize and conceptualize and what they've been able to draw from it, it's really rich. So I think it's finding that balance of making sure that they can understand it. And then, it leads to other things. And I always, without fully understanding all of the language, the talawa leads to tazkiyah. Like if you have that understanding, your ability to work with something and not just understand it, but teach it as well, there's a power in that.
I have a question here about adults. How you recommend teaching second language for adults?
That's a great question. Sister Maisa, it's less of my area. I've focused more from a research perspective, but I've been a second language teacher for adults as a teacher. So not from that research perspective, but more from my experience. I think that for an adult to learn a second language, if an adult has what research will tell us, if an adult has a fairly good first language, they should be able to transition to second language. It's learning vocabulary and then understanding the syntax of the language. The piece that's often missing with that is, and I was speaking to my hairdresser about this, is if you allow yourself opportunities to not learn it. So when we say, just immerse a kid in the classroom and they're going to do well, not necessarily. Or sometimes people have these damaging myths like, don't let them speak their first language. How dare they? That's harmful to kids and it's antiquated linguistically. That's wrong. But really, for an adult, setting up those opportunities where they already have that strong language to be able to practice it and speak it and the application of it, that's important. And then if they have that, it's a lot easier. If they don't have that and we leave them, an adult has more faculty and agency to be able to work through a book and work through the exercises to be able to do something. But, I think then it comes down to their motivation and what they're able to do independently without being immersed in a language. And I think that's where, I picked up a lot of Arabic working overseas on contract for 4 months in Qatar. It helped immensely, but I also surrounded myself with people who are speaking Arabic. I think it's very situational.
There's a book I can't remember the title of, just recently written by a couple of people who traveled the world, and they would go to an area of the world, spend a few months there, and just immerse themselves in the language. And they picked 3 languages in the span of 2 years. But these people were just traveling. They were not at work, right? And so they go, they spend some time in a country, learn the language, and they picked up 3 languages. I have the book. I can circulate it for anybody who may be interested. But see, the condition that these people find themselves at is not given for anybody. At Horizon, we have adults coming to us to learn Arabic language, and they come once a week on Sunday. It's a bit difficult, really, to make a lot of progress with 3 hours a week.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on how language is taught too. What I often see in second language programs is there's an over focus on grammar. So if people are learning English, it's 172, I would say, predominant grammatical rules in the English language. We only use 10 of them often. And so, the lion's share of comprehension in language is vocabulary and discourse. So what I would focus on in teaching language is 3 things: vocabulary, syntax, how language is structured together, the words structured together. Because, if someone gets the first 2,000 words of a language, they're proficient in terms of conversational language. Then fitting the syntax together and how they fit together, they can learn that. And they can compare and see how verbs conjugate from one language to the next, or how words like Arabic being pronouns, how it works together. They can learn that and then compare, because they already have a decent understanding of syntax in their language. They can draw those comparisons. Then the third piece is just immersion in good discourse. But I do think that there's ways that we need to teach vocabulary better. I'm in my dining room. I wish that my computer was actually in my living room. I've been buying these books in Arabic, picture dictionaries for the Arabic language, the first 1,000 words for kids to learn the Arabic language. Like, that's a great way for us to immerse kids in language through visuals, opportunities to use it. If you look at that paradigm of 36 exposures to a language, you need to do a really good job of exposing them to that and then recycling it often. So a good expectation around learning a new word would be using it in a basic way. In 1970, a scholar named Frere came up with the Frere model, the four squared model. And they would have, the student come up with a definition of their own word. Then they would have the student write the word out. Then they would have them create a visual of it. And then use an example of it or a non-example. And that's a powerful model. There's a scholar out of the United States named Marzano. And in the early 2000s, he did a cross-jurisdictional study, a big study, where he took, I think, a number of professionals in different backgrounds, and he tried to look at what their common denominator for success was. And it was their background knowledge. And their background knowledge on anything, the biggest piece of that was their vocabulary. And so he came up with a really simple measurement. He put this in schools across a number of states. And what he looked at, the measure was that they were going to teach kids vocabulary by coming up with lists of vocabulary that they felt was important. They would introduce the word to the students, have the students take that term and put it in their own words, draw a visual around that word, and then they would recycle the word, so they would make sure they used it through games or what have you. They came back later with control groups to look at the group who had this vocabulary intervention, the group that didn't. And what they saw is they saw a 33% increase in the performance overall between one class who had it and one class who didn't within 1 year. So teaching vocabulary and doing it properly is very powerful.
Dr. Sharif comments that communicative approach is more beneficial than grammatical one. I think you alluded to this in this conversation tonight. I just posted the name of the book that I alluded to. Is Fluent in 3 Months by Benny Lewis is the book. Any other burning question? I know the East Coast is 2 hours ahead of us. There is 20 to 10 p.m. over there in Washington and Toronto and the area. This actually have been a great conversation, and we really thank you, and we're grateful that the outcome of your study and PhD work was first heard here at Horizon. I thank everybody who joined us today. I just wanted to announce that the Leadership Institute of Horizon Academy will be attempting to bring speakers on a monthly basis. We will bring some Arabic speakers at a time, and we'll try to alternate between Arabic speakers and English speakers on a variety of topics that touch into our vision and mission. Jazakumullah khairan, and stay safe and have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Dr. Nuruddin. Thank you, everybody.